I asked, you may or may not need these, but since it seemed like we were probably going to talk about the original, the draft, the reduced draft that Nikki sent out, and the Lenexa one, we'd had a lot of comments. That's what's in this packet.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Looks like we're ready to go. It's a few minutes after 9:30, but it looks like we've got our crowd at this point. So I will open the April 19th meeting of the City of Topeka Policy and Finance Committee meeting. My name is Karen Hiller, and I'm the chair. If my colleagues would introduce themselves.
Good morning. My name is Tony Emerson, representing District 4.
Jeff Cohen, representing District 8.
All right. With that, our subject of the day, what we've been working on is a new tax increment financing policy for the city. We have had 2 meetings on that subject. So the first action item on our agenda is to approve the minutes from the March 29th meeting. I would entertain a motion.
I'll motion.
Moved
For approval, a second?
and seconded to approve the minutes of March 29th. Discussion? Amendments? Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
The minutes stand approved. And the next and only a major item on our agenda is to discuss next steps in the TIF policy. And just to bring it current for people who are watching, we started out with an original item, an original proposal. We had a number of conferees at our last meeting. From one of those conferees, from Curtis Sneeden at the Chamber, who had visited with a variety of folks, we were presented a red line, substantially marked up version for consideration. All of us should have those. Nikki Lee, our staff person, with that in mind, Nikki and I consulted, and it appeared that the common thread was simply to shake that thing down. Or that there was a lot of language in there that was useful, but maybe, in fact, was just cluttering it up. Not so much that we needed to separate policy from procedure, but that we just needed to state what our policy was and keep it simple in that way. So you received a few days ago, and we sent out to the conferees as well, that draft with greatly reduced. We also have had a fair amount of input that people like the Lenexa policy, and so I asked to have copies out today just in case we wanted to talk about that. I know that staff used that Lenexa policy as reference when they did the first draft and the subsequent second draft as well.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
What makes the Lenexa TIF policy more attractive?
I will defer to Mr. Peterson as well as to staff. Nikki, would you start and talk about what you pulled out of it and give us some thoughts?
I would say from a staff perspective, generally I think what's kind of attractive about Lenexa, not just their policy, but their overall handling of TIFs, is that they've clearly had a lot of successes. So people recognize that they've had some great TIF projects. So I think that they, accredit a lot of that to the policy and the way that they approach managing some of those. So I think that's one just overarching statement, is that they've got a really good process with economic development and a lot of very great projects to show for it. One thing I would say from a staff perspective, what's appealing about it is that they have a very clear policy separate from a procedures document to kind of, like was explained in the beginning, keep the policy maybe a little bit more clean if that's the goal, but also have the set of procedures that provides a very clear direction for staff from the city manager about how to proceed. So that's definitely, I think, something that staff likes about their policy. It's just, it's been well developed over time, and it's clearly, you read that policy and you have a very clear vision of what Lenexa wants from its TIF projects. I know from Mr. Ledbetter, the definitions are appreciated and the way that some of that's laid out. Really, that's kind of a stylistic approach. Most of these definitions are in state statute, and so we'd kind of lean on those rather than maybe adding that link to our policy, but that's just a stylistic difference. You could choose one way or the other. And then finally, I would say something that it is, some cities might really appreciate about their policy is it definitely protects the city's interests. It goes at long length to explain the types of incentives that it will and won't include in a TIF reimbursement. And then it goes into a lot of detail about if there were bonds or any kind of special obligation bonds taken out on behalf, what that stipulations would look like and how that would be structured. So definitely kind of protects the city and lays out what the city would prefer. I would say that there's a few requirements in here that are very restrictive, and I would think that from a developer perspective, those items would be a lot more obtrusive than some of the items in our policy, and we talked about a few of those with a couple of the conferees that, maybe in 10 years when we've got a well-developed TIF process and great projects to stand for, maybe we can start to add some of those requirements in. But at this point, there are a lot of reimbursements that are excluded in this policy that our policy allows for. So I would think that from a developer perspective, that they wouldn't want to take word for word a lot of the requirements in this policy and apply that to ours, or it would be a lot more restrictive than what we have. So if that kind of gives you an overview of the appeal.
That's very helpful. I
just have another question.
Go ahead.
Sometimes don't we compare ourselves to Lenexa? Don't we do that?
I don't know, do you?
Well, just in size and things like that. How many TIF projects do they have?
I would suggest that we can talk about it further, but they are part of a huge metroplex, and they are a very hot market. We are standalone, and we are not hot yet. And so, and I don't say that in a negative way, but it makes a difference to some extent. We need to be careful. I would suggest not to give away the store because we're so eager for development. At the same time, we want to have a good, strong policy that I don't know what they started with, but you do balance how flexible you are with what you've got.
Sure. So they've got, to answer the question though, they have 4 TIF districts, but in each of those districts, they have multiple project plans. So the city center TIF district, that's they decided as a governing body, that's where they wanted development to happen. And so, when they first started their policy, they very intentionally set that area up as a TIF district, which is something that our policy contemplates, that we might say, here's the areas of town that are kind of ripe for these TIF developments.
And when you say they, you mean that the city itself set up that district?
Yes, so the city of Lenexa. And then over time, multiple project plans have been laid in that district. So they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. They have 19 separate project plans that over time, some of them overlap, they have different timelines, but it's kind of I think it's played out in a way we would want something to play out. Where we as a council, you might say, here's the area we want this to occur, and then developers have come in with these project plans and had a lot of success with those individual plans.
Yes.
Thank you, Nikki, for that. A question, though, if we have something like that, where there's multiple plans, still by state statute, when we establish it, the clock starts running, correct? So you may come in and project number 19 may only get a few years of benefit. Is that correct?
So the clock doesn't start on each of those project plans until those individual project plans come in. So a district really kind of sets aside the boundaries, but then project plans start individual clocks for each of those.
Okay,
So
and that
they
is
do
the
each have their own
20,
clock.
the 20-year?
Yes.
Okay.
So for instance, when we set Wheatfield's
Yeah.
TIF district, it was last fall, right? And then it was some months later before we set the project plan.
And the
And the project plan was the
is
kickoff.
what starts the TIF time. Okay, okay.
So,
Thank you for that
like, for
clarification.
example, how theirs played out is that, but you're right, that's why you wouldn't want to set a district up without thinking or knowing that some of these project plans are going to fall in, because as a city, you have established that base for that overall district. So in their case, they called that Project Plan 1, and the city used that increment to start purchasing the land and be the landowner of that land. So it does establish that
So they
with that
did.
district and that project plan, that first one, and then each of those new individual ones starts a whole new timeline for each individual plan.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Would you want to talk a little bit then about, you made some references that touched on it, but why, what the differences are between the TIF 1 and ours? Obviously, you made a choice to blend some things. That will help us segue into looking back at ours. You looked at some different ones and made some choices for us.
Sorry, you mean specifically talk about Lenexa or
I think, well, since we
generally?
started with Lenexa,
Sure.
I mean, make the references in terms of what's different. We've had some, you've already touched on some points that we've
Sure.
had some proponents that felt like we should do that instead of what was proposed,
Yeah,
and
we
so
can do
it
that.
will be helpful.
Sure.
Understand both a little better.
So if you've got that all in front of you, and for those of you that are watching, you can, it's pretty easy to, I mean, even if you just Google search Lenexa TIF policy, you should be able to find the direct link to their document. On the first page, that's just, as I said, a style. They lay out objectives, scopes, and definitions, and that's probably how Lenexa does all of their policies. And in Topeka, we just don't have them laid out that way. So actually, one of the sections that we struck was, we had some overall kind of policy goals. That was our original section 1. And that's just, most of our policies don't start out with that kind of a redundancy of some of that. So really that's a style. There's really nothing that we lose by not having anything on these first few sections of what's in their policy. And really I think it goes on even on the second page. The definition of the blighted areas and the conservation areas, that's set by state statute, and that's nothing that needs to be duplicated within our own policy. If you go on to...
If I can stop you for a second, because
Sure.
you're going to get into some more of these. As I looked at them beforehand, I saw that too. You all made a choice that if it was in state statute, or for instance, the tax increment financing even, that we didn't need to repeat it. On an assumption that developers would either already know it, or
They know it.
or could find it. So, but yet Lenexa, it appears, said, well, let's just put it all down anyway in one place.
And I think that's a stylistic.
Gotcha. Okay.
You could go either way on that. Either way, both on the city side and on the legal staff of the developers, they all know there's no way that they're not reading both documents. It is definitely something that is a constant reference back and forth. And generally, we figure that what should be in our policy is anything that's more restrictive than what might be in the state statute.
Okay.
So really, if you skip ahead to section GB05, which starts at the very bottom of page 3 that says provisions, that's kind of, their provisions section is similar to our preferences section. So our new section that states preferences, that's really where the meat of the policy is. And so they go through and they lay out, the legal authority, that section B on page 4, eligible redevelopment project cost. That's again where kind of they decided to go through some detail and listing some of that out that might not, you could choose to do that or choose not to. But very specifically in section 2 there, regardless of the act, the policy, that the city's policy that redevelopment projects should not include, and really A, B, C, F, all of those items are things that our policy allows for reimbursement. So things like, when you read it, it maybe sounds insignificant, but it talks about soft costs, attorney fees, engineering costs. All of those costs are parts of doing a project. If they weren't doing that project, they wouldn't have those costs. And that's a significant amount of money. So that would be a big departure from our current policy and inconsistent with our past practice to have that in our policy. We could add that as they have, but that would be a big deal. That would be, translate to a significant amount. And then kind of going on from that, on page 5, the bond authority, section C. Councilman Hiller and I had a lot of conversation about how much to go into. From the get-go, we say we don't want to do bonds for these projects.
Right.
So, why go into this extensive detail on, we don't want to do bonds, but if we do, here's a couple pages of what we would do. So we would rather cover that in procedures and just work through that if it came up with kind of our bond counsel and our current requirements and philosophy that we have there, rather than line that all out. With the extensive amount of project plans that they've had and all of the different financing they've done, there's got to be a reason that's in here, and I'm sure it's because of the specific instances they've had with specific projects. So we just kind of chose that it's not necessary to go into that amount of detail on something that we really don't prefer.
And also, we have procedures, we have policy and procedures
Yeah.
if we are going to bond ourselves or partner with others, correct?
Exactly. And at the end of the day, that's all kind of spelled out in the development agreement. Even when you have all of this, ultimately you have another agreement, and then you've got the actual bond documents. I mean, there's multiple levels at which point you have to come to an agreement on these things.
Okay.
And really that follows throughout page 6. That's, again, them speaking more about bonds and IRBs and kind of how it interacts with those. We chose to keep that part of our policy very clean rather than going into that level of detail, and that's just a choice. It's a stylistic choice. At the end of the day, we probably wouldn't do much different than what they're saying they would do. And then the reimbursement authority, so sections D and sections E. I'd say the same kind of general point, that theirs goes into probably a more detail than ours currently does. Specifically on that section 3, application of but-for principle on page 7. They go into a lot of detail on how that is decided on. In our policy right now, we do have a threshold of 20%, which is very important. That's a very kind of key takeaway of our document, that we have that number stated. But we've chose to kind of not include all of these, kind of all of it A through F on exactly how that might be applied. And that is something we even spoke yesterday about, it's good and bad to leave that a little more open-ended, but in reality, every project is so different and every negotiation is so different that it really likely benefits both parties to leave that a little more open-ended, at least based on the state that we're at. And then really it goes on, I'd say everything on page 8, really that's the last page that speaks about procedures. So that's the new section that we have at the very end of our document, that we would create, city manager would create a set of procedures, and the statutory amendments and responsibility for enforcement. We have that language, it's just in the style of how Topeka states those items. So if that helps, the substantive content is similar. It's really a stylistic and I'd say an experiential difference for how they've gotten to where they are versus where we're at with our TIF policy.
That was excellent. That really helped me understand choices that we made, or that you made in coming up with our first version and then this second one. I think we needed to talk through the Lenexa one because it's been advocated so much, so that's helpful too.
Yeah.
Other questions about, yes?
I guess just in general, I do like it, and I totally understand what you're talking about, Nikki, about our thing has been, seems like in our resolutions or our ordinances, we don't have definitions. I like that. It seems like working in the contracting world, our specifications always have definitions, and our contracts always have definitions, and I do like that, and I think it might be a language kind of developers speak more. It just gives some certainty. However, that's not something I think is critical if it is included in the state statute, but I would just want that to be relatively accessible.
Maybe I've got a suggestion, and I'll defer. We should have introduced Miss Nikki. Nikki Lee is who's been talking, and is our finance
Director.
Finance director. But Mary Feeney is here from the city attorney's office. And Mary, correct me if I'm wrong, but only within the last 5 years, I want to say 5 years, the city of Topeka did a full sweep through the whole municipal code and pulled the definitions out of each single section and made a master section of definitions so that we did not have conflicting definitions from one set of policies to another, which it meant that the definitions in most cases were stripped out of where they'd been, but it did align then the definitions in our whole code. If it's that important to mention, sort of like ours mentions in the back, could there, this is a question at this point, could there be a reference upfront definitions that a section that just referred the reader to the state statutes on tax increment financing and our own guidelines on bonding and master definitions? Could that satisfy? I mean, it wouldn't all be in one
Yes.
place. but-
Absolutely, and I guess my thought was, maybe the definitions would be in the procedure. You know, we could list out the definitions like Lenexa did in our procedure portion, which is, a developer's not going to come in, I wouldn't think, and necessarily read our resolution or our ordinance.
Okay, or in the application, if you will, whatever
Right.
our application document is.
Right. Once the staff comes up with the procedure, I would suggest maybe that is a place where we should have definitions.
I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
You know, and thank you for that, because I think that our conferees made really good points, but we needed to sift out then what needed to really be in the policy and what the documents were. I know that and Ms. Lee and I worked through the original staff draft to see if we could take the feedback from the conferees. It was like, well, if we can strip it out and then we can have it in whatever, get it in a good order, which we need feedback from you all, good order in our statute, and then use that same order in any explanatory documents that are available to applicants, use the same order in the application forms, use the same order for scoring and whatever gets done internally to make decisions so that it syncs and that it's easy to follow.
I would add too that in addition to all of that, the development agreement itself has definitions for kind of the key points. I mean, really, you know, between the developer and the city, that's really where the meat in that, the development agreement is what kind of solidifies all of that specific to that project plan.
Sure.
And that's going to restate all the major definitions that are relevant to that project plan. So, I mean, if nowhere else, it's going to reappear in that, where it matters to that agreement.
And perhaps even specific definitions where something's been negotiated.
Exactly.
Okay. On the other hand, you were looking, one of the reasons you as staff proposed this was so that you did have something in policy that you could fall back on, so that if things, once they got down the line, really weren't negotiable, that we said so up front,
Yeah.
so that everybody understood. And are you, let's segue into our two versions at this point. Unless, Mr. Peterson, you would like to make some more comments. It was on your behalf that the advocacy for Lenexa was made, I believe. Do you want to make some about Lenexa?
Ms. Taylor, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Emerson, thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm Tom Peterson. I've been in commercial real estate in Topeka since 1978, 40 years next month. And I've done dozens of projects here, many of which you would recognize. Matter of fact, the building we're sitting in, I was selected years ago as the developer for the law enforcement center. And it was to be built next to the jail. And I looked at the site, and this property was available at that time. And so we negotiated with Montgomery Ward, put this under contract, and took this building to the city council as an alternative. Two arguments. One was that the jail would expand someday, and we were taking its land to expand, and it did. Secondly, that the building they designed didn't have the physical integrity that this building has. It wasn't large enough for both the police and the sheriffs. So this made all the sense, and this was cheaper, half the price. Anyway, that said,
Thank you.
I do quite a bit of work in Kansas City, have over the years, worked with developers there. The Lenexa TIF plan was the best organized plan as we came across various plans, whether it be in Wichita or Kansas City, various cities there. And so we just simply said, let's look at why this is successful. The glossary of terms is very important, because what we lack in Topeka is we go to planning, meet with the planners, and it's rare that there's clarity. It's rare that we come up with a site that's designated as a commercial development, and then the argument is, well, we really don't want that to be commercial, even though it's designated that way. And so just having a clear understanding of what the rules are is very helpful. And I think that's kept Topeka from growing, is just that. Simply being clear as to what direction do we want to go. At Huntoon and Wanamaker, I did an office park, Cracker Barrels there, Kansas Corporation Commission, through the years, probably 25 different projects. And for years, we fought with the city to widen Huntoon because we had traffic coming out of there. By then, we had the American Family Building, the school board building, KCC, on and on. So we had a lot of people trying to get out onto Huntoon. We could never, even though we were willing to pay half of the cost to widen Huntoon, it took Home Depot 15 years later from our first groundbreaking to get the city to consider widening Huntoon. And that, I can give you 100 examples of that, where the infrastructure just isn't laid out well. That's a different issue, except it is the same issue because it's lack of clarity, lack of planning, lack of giving us developers the tools we need to say, okay, I'll go invest $100,000 up front for my fees, attorneys, legal, engineering, so on. So I'm not advocating that we simply bring in the Lenexa plan and put it in place in Topeka. I'm saying, but let's use some of the good things that are there. Certainly Topeka isn't Lenexa, but in the 45 years I've lived here since I moved from Minneapolis, the cities like Lincoln, Nebraska, Springfield, Missouri, Des Moines, these cities that were about the size of Topeka 45 years ago have grown and grown and grown. And the argument we hear is that, well, Lincoln, Nebraska is Topeka is too close to Kansas City. Well, Lincoln, Nebraska is closer to Omaha than Topeka is to Kansas City, for example. Or we're a capital city, capital cities don't grow. Well, Des Moines is a capital city, Lincoln, Nebraska is a capital city. And so we have arguments against the argument that we're a capital city, so therefore we can't grow. I'm very bullish on Topeka. I've invested a lot of money here, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and I'm all for Topeka stepping forward with the opportunities to create these districts. You can create a district from the Kansas Turnpike south to the river and let developers come in and make applications for a piece of that, one developer after another. But by designing a district saying, we want this corridor to be less blighted. Recently, David came in and bought White Lakes. And Christie, yeah. And he recently bought Villa West. Mm-hmm. He's used TIF plans in various communities, including the one in Topeka. And people like that will welcome a district where we know that this area is welcome for development, redevelopment, and that will help us. So I just ask you to strongly consider a good plan. Don't recreate the wheel. Take good from other plans and then add to it where you see fit. Any questions for me? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And if you haven't had a one-on-one with our city manager, Mr. Trout, he would love to hear those 100. I think I can safely say that truthfully, because the examples that you mentioned are sobering to hear, but they were not policy questions. They were administrative, operational
Exactly.
questions and,
Sure.
and political questions. And maybe we all need to hear the 100, because I think we all do want Topeka to grow and thrive. I mean, it's growing and thriving now, but like Lincoln has done, for instance, and sometimes all those pieces work together they have to work together for us to grow and thrive. And
They should.
If any of them aren't working, you just feel strangled and people do get discouraged.
Yeah.
We know that that's happened.
Yeah, and Topeka is designated as a third-tier city out of 4 tiers. So that's already working against us, where the national tenants say, well, we can spend the same money in this city and do better. And so it's a constant battle to bring new businesses here because of that designation. I'd like to see that change. My son David graduated a year ago from University of Kansas, and he likes my business. He's been interning for me for a few years while he was in college, and he wants to stay in Topeka. And I look at that and I think, man, the battles I've fought here to get things done, I don't know if I want him to put himself through that. But it's a joy to have him around me, and he's very good at what he's taking on. And so for the young people of this community, it's really imperative that we grow, or we're not going to keep them. And that's been the case for years here. So anyway, personal stuff.
Well, thank you so much. You know, one of the things that I think I've observed as we started moving, let's say 9 years ago, whatever it was that you need to have fun. It needs to be fun. It needs to be fun to work. It needs to be fun to play. And we're working on that, and we need that wisdom. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you. I know that we've got at least 1 or 2 other conferees here that have looked at all 3 of these. Do you want to talk about these more? Do you want first, or you want to invite other
Let's hear what
comments?
they have to say. Yeah.
Other comments, please?
So grab a coffee real quick.
Okay, yes.
Okay, sure. Lucky DeFreeze, I'm here on behalf of AIM Strategies. And first of all, I just want to thank all of you for having kind of taken the lead on looking at all this. I think it's helpful. I think based on the discussions, it's obviously an important issue and something that we need to be working on. Secondly, we appreciate your willingness to look at some of the suggestions. I know there have been conversations with council people, also with your staff, and everybody's been receptive to the comments that have been made. I think it's obvious that based on our last conversation that we had a month ago or so, that there was an attempt to look at and respond to some of the comments and suggestions. And I would concur also with regard to, I think Nikki was spot on with regard to the Lenexa situation. There clearly are some good things. They've been at this for a long time. But I think as she pointed out, there are some things that are part of our policies right now that offer some flexibility and some attractiveness to those that would be looking at developing here. And I think it's important to retain those. And I think it's the same thing that Tom just indicated too. I think what they were looking for was trying to maybe look at Lenexa as a guide to some extent, because they have been at this for a long time. Pick the good things out of that, but also retain the things that we have already in our policy that would be attractive to potential developers at this point. I think we all recognize, I mean, we're getting started with this. This is probably something that's going to evolve. I think we've sensed that there's a willingness to look at and respond to things as we move forward here. So hopefully, as we continue to, work through this and get started, if things come up, if we identify things that perhaps need to be adjusted a little bit, I think we can continue to have that conversation. So we appreciate your efforts, everyone's efforts, council and staff, and I think we do appreciate the efforts that you've made to incorporate many of the suggestions that were made before. Be happy to respond to any questions.
Well, let me start, and maybe I'll be the only one. What Nikki and I did was simply take the comments and kind of wash through the first version we'd had and just, I don't know, for lack of a better term, stripped it. We just said, all right, if what they want is sort of a checklist of what our policy is, and we don't need the extra in terms of procedures or redundancies or anything, we did the best that we could to take a first run at just stripping it. And I know when I read it afterward, I thought, man, that is stripped. I mean, the sections are short. We haven't done a second round on it, if we should. I mean, it just looked stripped to me. Reactions from you as to how it reads in that second version, it still doesn't have the kind of the flow or the bullet type structure that is nice to see, or that Lennox has had, for instance. Do you think that that the revised draft is something we could go with? Would you suggest something in between, style changes? Give us a reaction, if you would.
I think a lot of what we were looking for is some of the really substantive things, some of the issues that Curtis kind of walked through the last time, and I think Jennifer also on behalf of Midwest made some comments. So I think we've been really kind of focused on some of those really substantive issues that we think might affect the decisions that are being made by potential developers. I think some of the things that you're alluding to there, we could still perhaps have some conversations with you to maybe just in terms of the structure. But I think clearly, I think we sensed that there was an attempt to respond to trying to separate some of the policy from the procedure there. We could still probably have some conversations about maybe exactly how that is structured at this point. But I think substantively, a lot of the things that we were looking at and felt could be tweaked a little bit, we saw an effort to respond to those. I mean, I think what all of us are really looking for is something that when people who are wanting to develop look at this, they can understand what the ground rules are, they can understand the definitions, and there's something that appears to be attractive, welcoming, and I think that's the message that the city's wanting to send at this point, is that we're open for business and we're wanting to encourage people to develop here. And so I think, when Curtis was walking through some of those things that were kind of a compilation of some of the things that had been heard from others, and I think it's the same thing that Jennifer responded to. We've been trying to look at this not just in terms of how some of the developers that are involved in some of the larger projects might respond, but maybe some of the folks that are with the smaller projects that don't have all the resources that others have. And so when they look at this, does it look like something that would say to them, Topeka's interested in encouraging us to develop here, and we'd like to, try this. And I think some of the changes that you've made have been an attempt to respond to some of those things. And I think that, there's still some things. I think there have been some conversations after we saw this draft, and I think we've had some receptivity to that, and some of the comments that we've heard here today, I think, suggest that there's a continued willingness to look at some of these things and try and take the best from some of the other proposals and come up with something that makes sense for us here. Because I think, as was discussed, Lennox is in a much different situation at this point than we are. We hope that we have continued interest in utilizing programs such as TIF and some of the others that are available. We're not to their point yet, but we hope that we will be in the not-too-distant future.
Well, when we went through it, all the red line from last time, and if you all were involved both in what was on paper, but in Curtis's comments especially, and not that we're really inviting change, but there really weren't substantive changes. It turned out that it was mostly like, you've already said it, don't say it again, or you're sounding negative, you need to respin this thing to be a positive assertion of what the policy is, not, we won't do that and we won't do that. And so really, what we did was just stripped out a lot, but there weren't changes. And so that's what I wanted to double check. Again, not necessarily inviting that, but it was kind of affirming to the staff that they had nailed those various substantive policy issues. And if it was just how it read, so you felt welcomed or you didn't, or you felt like you didn't have to slog through 8 pages when it could have been 4 pages, then we got that far. We want to move on with this, but not in overdue haste. And so I guess to drill that down, do you think we can go with what's here? Do you have any minor amendments to that, or do we need to retool and restructure, in your opinion?
I don't want to speak for the others too. I mean, I think we're getting much closer than, where we were before, and I think a lot of progress was made with respect to that. I don't know what others think in terms of, there could probably be some additional conversations here to maybe just kind of, even in response to what we've discussed here today, I don't think nearly as much work would have to be done, as what's already been done, which was a really good effort here. There probably could be, maybe in response to some of what we've heard today, a little bit, more time to just maybe fine tune and massage things a little bit before we try and launch things. Just a thought.
Well, we really, the second version that you saw really was just stripped out to see if we were getting there, and if we were, then great.
I think we're well on our way there, but a little extra time, especially we do want to get this right. We want everybody to feel good about it. So I think probably maybe just a little bit more time for everybody to have some more of these conversations. They seem to have been going well, and everybody's receptive, and there's a good dialogue. So if we can maybe just take one last look at it, fine tune it a little bit, I think that would probably be productive.
And so you didn't have any, again, I didn't want you to do a lot of work without that overview either.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of us did, but you didn't bring any specific reactions, or amendments or tweaks.
Not specifically today. I know just
Okay.
leading up after we saw this, there have been some conversations even as late as yesterday, I think, and I think there was good feedback from those.
Okay.
And so, and I think we've had some more good feedback today, some good discussion. So I think maybe if we just kind of take some of what's been discussed at those and maybe one last look at it and, see if there's some things we can do to, even tweak it, improve it just a little bit more, so much the better.
Thank you.
Sure.
Jennifer, do you have any? We did, as for the viewers, it may be obvious, but we affirmatively got this out early to all the conferees that came before so that they'd had a chance to see it and could be prepared with a little feedback. So we really appreciate your time in advance and today.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Stork, and I am General Counsel for Midwest Health, who is also the developer on Wheatfield Village, which will begin site work probably within the next couple of days. So we're really excited about the progress going there. I want to first really thank the committee and Nikki's hard work on the first draft to now and having these conversations. I think they've been productive. I think overall they're really great for our community, and we've seen a drastic change in the responsiveness to some of the developers' comments in this latest draft. So I did want to thank everyone for their hard work on it. Actually, Nikki and I visited at length yesterday. There's I mean, I could ask for the world and moon and stars, right? So there's I mean, there's a couple of things that we just generally talked about, but overall, I think this policy is more in line with a welcoming tone, with the intent of the city being open for business and welcoming developers to seek us out and being competitive, which is a big part of the conversation that we have, is being competitive with other surrounding cities so that we attract the business and the developers here in our community, and not lose them out to other communities that may offer additional incentives or more beneficial incentives to those involved. And so overall, there isn't a lot of comments. I think this is a really strong improvement from the previous draft, and again, appreciate the work that went behind it, because it was very responsive. With that said, I think if you're looking for specific comments, I think some of the discussion or understanding is, for instance, the design criteria. What does that really mean? It's section 4, it's page 5, as far as the highest development standards, and Nikki and I visited a little bit about that, and I think it's just something that comes up in our experience. It came up in the development agreement, and we walked through that process, but I don't know if there are the highest development standards are defined by the planning side, and what that actually means. So I mean, the example of us in our development would be, we have a hotel component. Are you bringing in a lower level hotel, an economy type hotel? Are you bringing in something nice? And so those were negotiated as to what, if they're branded or what class they are in. And so kind of making sure that that's understood. But I think that's just more of a clarification issue that can be addressed, not necessarily in the TIF policy, but that was just some feedback that we were talking about. The other, I think, feedback or still question is the relocation requirement, and having not incentivizing relocation, but it's a loose enough policy that you don't want to encourage just one business to move from one space to another. But I think as you work through that requirement, there's different examples of where it worked out well. I think the Joann's fabric is an example where it worked out well, and the other one that just popped in my head, just trying to brainstorm about some that have happened, would be something like the Bajillion Agency, who has an office on the west side but has purchased a building and renovating and receiving incentives to move downtown. And that's something the city has been working towards, is try to get more businesses and commercial development within our downtown core. So that would be another example of a relocation that would be supported by the city through the incentives, but may be against the policy or not fluidness and openness with the relocation requirement. So overall, I think that's it. The other question in our conversation, and Nikki walked through, and may be good for everyone to hear and for the Finance Committee as a whole to hear, is together as an application, you have the $30,000 requirement in the TIF, but overall, if you were to apply for a development that included everything, like the Wheatfield did, a very large development, what are those costs between all the application fees and everything? What is the total cost to the developer to come to our community? So, and I'll let Nikki talk to that, because.
Yeah, to that point, we just discussed a little bit that right now, she said, what if there was another Wheatfield tomorrow that came and they wanted a CID and a TIF, and what would their overall fee requirement be from the upfront? And before this policy existed, we just had the CID application fee, so this does add a TIF application fee. And then this one states the dollar amount, the $30,000 deposit that would be used for professional services and professional consultation. The CID policy included that as well, but it didn't state a dollar amount. So in the example with Wheatfield, when they approached the city, we knew that was a negotiation where we said, give us a deposit of $25,000, and that should cover the costs of both analysis, because when it's a CID and a TIF together, it's all one and the same. I mean, it's going to get kind of folded together. So that would be the expectation here, is that if there was a large project, they wouldn't be giving us, a $30,000 deposit plus another
$30,000,
yeah, large size deposit on the CID side, plus all the application fees. But that is a good point. If that project came forward right now, there would be the $30,000 plus the $1,500 application fee, plus the $5,000 application fee. But before, there was that expectation for the $30,000 equivalent. It just wasn't officially in a policy. It was something that was negotiated each time. So
And so
it isn't a huge departure from our practice, but we definitely would want to make it clear that it wouldn't be kind of doubled up if it didn't need to be.
Do we need language for that? So if what you're talking about is overlaid or layered incentives, that some of the fees could be combined?
No, I think that's procedural in nature.
Okay.
I think it was just a question just to make sure everyone was on the same page. If a full project, something very large comes into play, what is that? And I think this fee is in line with what other communities do and have, but we wanted to make sure it was just clear that there wasn't a $30,000 deposit on the TIF policy and then another $30,000 deposit on a SID policy application, that they'd be overlapped, because at the end of the day, they become one development agreement.
We might want to have legal double check that so that.
Yeah, I think that's for the procedures document and the application itself. That's a perfect place to include that kind of language. And,
But
at
if
the
our-
end of the day, we'll all be reasonable when we're
If our
negotiating.
policy is firm without any exception, you wouldn't be able to do that. So we need to make sure that the legal language is such that you've got the flexibility administratively to stack them. So that would be something to check. If we could go back to your other 2 points on the design standards, you had observed that and talked about it, but your very example was one I remember them talking about. Obviously, and this is from the experience that I've had with this in the past and here with the city, what we're looking for in this policy overall in almost every section is just to kind of set the bar for what we're looking for, knowing that each project is different and that how you might define within that particular, how you might talk about it would be different. So you mentioned the hotel. I mean, that was not, I guess it was designed, but also, as I understand it, some conversations about what would be the most appropriate and likely to be for your site, likely to be the most successful and fill a niche that we had a hole in Topeka's marketplace, right?
I think when we're talking about design criteria, in addition to what kind of, level of quality that's being built, and it may be or appreciation. I'm trying to think of how to word that, because there may be other areas where it may be like an industrial area. So you have, where you have the Mars plant industrial site, which was a LEED 5, very high state-of-the-art as far as the environmental impact and footprint it puts on, but you may have another industrial plant come in that doesn't do that and what the design standards are, and so I think that was just kind of more of a clarification, or not even a clear understanding of what is that criteria, what is the expectation, and is planning looking at that? Is it a simultaneous process? I mean, I think it's more conversational as far as the policy. I think it's actually fine.
Okay.
I think it's
That's
just
what I was thinking,
Yeah,
but
I think it's fine. I just think there's just maybe a lack of understanding or clarity in making sure that everyone's on the same page. But
You think it's all right? Because really, with a number of these, and this being a good example, we did strip out some additional language because you all said it was too much, and you can hang yourself with too much language
Right.
anyway. So that was arguably a really good recommendation, but just then in consolidating that to say the quote highest development standards without a definition
Right.
purposefully, so that it could be discussed, and that's part of establishing what that project plan would have, as well as how confident we are that it would be successful, how much money we're willing to give up, and so on.
Right, so
Right.
it's a defined term because of how it's in quotation marks, but it's not really a defined term, so the lawyer in me gets a little, questions a little bit of that.
But y'all know that you lawyers, that sometimes it's good
Oh,
to
I
have
know.
it be subjective and not too specific, right?
Right. So I think that's just the clarity.
And the same question on the relocation, in that, for instance, when we did Joanne's, which was a SID, but nonetheless, that document was quite involved, and it separated the amount of benefits that were allowed based on whether Joanne's, for instance, being relocated, there was a difference, I want to say, in the sales tax, because we didn't want to give away old sales tax, if you will, but only new sales tax. And so the fact that it was a relocation made a difference in the ultimate development agreement.
I would put back to you, though, as far as the CID, it's an additional sales tax, so it's actually not revenue taken away from the city and incentivizing that project, because the CID is an additional
Did we have
level.
I can't remember now exactly how it was, but even so, there was some separation between Orscheln's and,
Can I clarify that?
Yeah.
I process this every month, so.
yeah, thank you.
What happened in this case is the CID, CID, that's a very important distinction. That's the amount of sales tax above and beyond what the city's already getting. So in moving the location from one place to the next, you're really not taking away what the city's getting in sales tax.
No.
Because you're still getting that. It's the increment that the developer is getting. But in addition to that increment, in this CID I'm not sure where the request came, but in the development agreement, there was an extra incentive called the STR that was a portion of the city's sales tax.
Yes. I knew there was
And it was a
this in
target
there.
per year and a certain
Yep.
percent of that sales tax. So there is an amount of money that from the city's general fund that is going to the developer, and that was just negotiated as part of the deal. But that portion excludes any of the property that was just moved from somewhere else in the city. So that increment is
Yeah.
only based on the new properties in that district.
Thank you. I knew it was in there. So that is the example, even though, thank you so much, where it was a negotiating point in layering the whole deal. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, if I could ask, Jennifer, on the, you hit on the same point that I actually had a discussion with Nikki this morning on the way over here about. When I see something, like you said, when I see something in quotations, then it says, as outlined by the city's adopted development policies for commercial, industrial, anyway. Is that defined in those policies? I just assumed it was.
That's where our discussion came from as well, is on the planning side, we don't know if it's.
Without having the planning director here, I ran this by him, and he said it was very good language, that was in compliance with his
We probably just should take
documents
the
and
quotes
procedures.
out if there isn't specific, if you can't go and find a definition in those policies about what the highest standard is.
Yeah.
Because
I think we can definitely tell you that we'll look at that and make sure that where there's not a specific cross-check, that there wouldn't be a quotes.
I also, and this isn't necessarily related to Jennifer's testimony, but the last sentence of that also gives me I question what that means. Development proposals are expected to demonstrate innovative design with human scale that exceeds the design standards of conventional development throughout the city. And it seems to me, if you're a developer, if you're Mr. Peterson wanting to do something, you have the market. You're going to do it to the quality it needs to be done for the market. If Goodyear decides, Goodyear's not in the city, so a bad example, but if Boeing wants to come here and open an aircraft plant, we don't necessarily care how it looks, do we, with human scale? If they're going to bring high-paying jobs here.
Unless we're incentivizing, that's kind of the decision point is.
I would say if Boeing wants to come here with $100,000 jobs a year, we're going to help them. But I guess my point is, and I'm not trying to pick on you here, but it just seems, I don't know what that sentence means.
Like we talked on the phone, I think we
Yeah.
could get rid of that last sentence without losing the intent of this paragraph.
Okay.
or at least say it just once. I kind of liked it, but
I just
Well, I
don't know
think what
it-
you're saying, I
right.
mean, you think about, Reese's is putting in a new plant with some support from us, and it really looks nice. It is, there's a good scale, I mean, some of that's planning and some of it's very subjective, but it's an attractive property so that it's a real, in terms of us providing these incentives, not only to get those businesses here, but also to have somebody else who drives in on Highway 40 go, wow, this town is looking good. And this looks like a place where they probably do run a great shop and have good jobs that,
Sure.
that maybe it wouldn't just be Butler Barn style construction for Boeing or whoever.
Sure.
Whoever you get in here. I'm watching Tom nod in the back, so maybe you'd want to comment on that, the issue
Yeah.
about design, if you do come to the mic, but.
Yeah, I just don't, those words, innovative design with human scale, I don't know what that means.
I appreciate your comments. I think that's a good point, and that can all be negotiated throughout that process of what that
Sure.
looks like, as we did with the Wheatfield Village.
Based on the site and the
And the
whole
purpose and what it is
purpose.
it's bringing to, because there might be a different quality or standard from either the actual business and what they're doing. I mean, and just industrial is a good example of where that is, where you have a Mars with the lead 5, and Reese's, I'm sure they have efficiencies and some lower footprint on the environment, but what does that mean? And at the end of the day, it's kind of still a big box
Yeah.
to make their product. And so,
Right.
yeah. But again, I appreciate everyone's input and the reflecting the comments from our previous discussions, and working towards a good policy for our community. So if there's nothing further, I'll let Mr. Peterson speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Design is very important, certainly, especially when we develop 40-acre tracts, 50-acre tracts, knowing that one product is going to use an acre and a half of that, and we want to make the site attractive to the next user, as in, again, where Cracker Barrel is and all of that. But Topeka has its limitations of what we can spend here, because our rents haven't moved at all with the market, the regional market. And Fleming Place, for example, that I developed 30 years ago, our rents historically there have been $8 for small users. And I sold that property 3 years ago, and the people that bought it are out of Kansas City. And as vacancies have happened there, they'd like to see $12, $13, $14 rent. Topeka isn't there. And so where design is compromised is in understanding what kind of rent we can charge. And the more expensive the building, the more rent. And unfortunately, we can't typically build what we'd love to build because of those limitations. Real estate taxes here are high. When they went up in 1989 because of reclassification, reappraisal, the mall here became the highest price mall for real estate taxes of any of the Simon malls. It went from 80 cents per square foot up to $7. I owned the shopping center across the street where Central Bank and Talbot's, I developed that. And our rents were $8 there. And so their CAM at the mall was double our rent. And so anyway, those are the limitations. Hopefully that will change with some of the decisions that you folks are making right now, where we can attract tenants that can afford to pay for what the quality that we'd like to see here. Any questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other comments from the conferees that are here? Okay, colleagues, any penciling that you made or on the new version or comments that you have overall done?
Thank you. My only other thing I saw, I have that question, those two questions on design. I guess there's actually two things that I noticed. One was on the procedures. Ours says the city manager may develop procedures, but do we want that shall? I mean, we want the city manager to do that, is that correct?
I think so.
Okay.
So otherwise, we might not have any.
Right.
Okay.
Unless the city manager has an objection to that. The other thing was, in reading through, first of all, great job. I mean, I know Councilwoman Hiller as well as Mrs. Lee did a fantastic job, did a lot of work on this, so thank you. It's really cleaned up from our first version. However, in kind of as Jennifer was going through this, one thing that kind of hit me in reading through the preferences was in the preferences section, wherever that is now.
It's the very first one.
Page 2, number 3.
Thank
Are
you.
looking for the but for?
A lot of these sentences start out, the city will give preference to this, the city has a preference for development, has a preference to a TIF project. It seems like we have some of these things in here are the city's preferences, and then other things are,
Requirements.
yes. And I wonder if maybe we shouldn't have a section that's preferences, just listing out the preferences, as well as another section that's maybe requirements or.
Or could we rename this one priorities? Cover both? You're right, it's a mix.
We can use Linux as provisions.
There,
I don't know.
There you go.
Or we can talk to Mary about what the best term is there. I think we really would like this to be a section that's a catch-all for both. At least that was our intent when designing it.
Any thoughts from the developer field, whether there is a mix in what's been renamed for the first time, preferences of things that are shalls, that are absolute, and then preferences? Is it okay to mix them, or should we split them out? Okay.
just personally, I like it when I can, I personally like it split out, but
But that's why we're here.
Right.
Because we want it to flow, we want it to be simple, so that anybody, whether it's us as policymakers or a prospective developer, can go check, 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 yes, yes, no, yes, yes, boom. So, okay.
Or maybe at a minimum, if we don't, maybe group all the preferences in a line, right now, we kind of jump from one, we have a preference and a requirement, and then there might be two preferences
You're right.
and a requirement. And,
You're right.
And I know you guys are working with the red line copy, so you guys, it's
Yeah,
hard to
we
get the
really
flow.
just stripped it. We didn't reorganize anything.
Yeah, sure.
We just stripped it.
My only other note was, well, Nikki, we talked about this morning, and now I can't.
Line 74. But for-
Thank you. Yes, it says the city will provide priority consideration for projects where less than 20% of the project's costs are expected to be paid from public incentives. And that's saying the city would prefer, right? Isn't that really what we're getting at there? The city would prefer projects where less than 20% of the cost, right? Because
Yeah, it doesn't say it's absolute. That's your question?
right, I just wonder if that shouldn't be the city would prefer, because priority consideration, I don't know what that means.
We're not
because-
really comparing, that was discussed
Right.
before.
Yeah, we usually have one of these at a time we're looking at, and,
Would prefer is what you're suggesting.
yes,
And there may be some other places where we say priority. I think that came up in the first discussion. Good
yeah.
point.
So maybe it should read, the city would prefer projects where less than 20% of the project's costs are expected to be paid from public incentives. And
So is that a preference or a requirement?
What was your intent? What was
I mean,
your?
that's going to be part of what you're running into in separating preferences versus requirements, is how hard line does this policy want to be on, for example, moving businesses from one area of town to the next? It's a little bit of I get a sense it's kind of, it depends on the project, and that we want to be
Correct.
flexible.
I-
But the intent there was that that number would be used as our expectation of the level of incentive. I
Well,
don't want to get
there's a
hung up on
clear
the
message.
words. The 20%, the but for and the 20% is the important part. So if there's a better word than priority consideration, then whatever that is fine.
Well, it's either must demonstrate or would prefer.
I
So-
think that's kind of the,
Well, again, I mean, I think we want to keep
Decision.
the gate as wide open as possible, right, for consideration of projects. I mean, you'd hate to have a person that had a fantastic project opportunity for the city, but, well, we need 22%, so I'm not even going to ask. I guess I think it's better to, open the gate wide and, attract as many of these as we can, rather than narrow it and maybe pass up opportunities we don't even know we're missing out on.
so prefer is fine.
That's my preference.
Okay.
We don't-
Is that your priority?
Yes, not my priority, but my preference.
I'm gonna look out to the audience again as well, because we did talk about it at the last exchange, that we want to incentivize, but we don't want to give away the store. So, would be eager either now or in the near future to have feedback as to whether that 20% is a reasonable absolute minimum. We're getting a no from city manager. Jennifer's coming up, he's coming up. All right, that's what we need.
I don't know if I have to talk from the microphone.
To be captured on film, to be captured on the video.
I think overall, the developer community thinks we should be giving away the store to get businesses here, and that's simply put.
Yeah, I think, when we look at a development that's coming in and the percentage of incentive that we're providing, what we're trying to say is that if there were two projects put side by side, if you look at it from the standpoint, if, say, we were doing an RFP for a hotel, and we were trying to recruit a hotel for a particular thing, we would be saying our priority consideration would be 20% being the max. So if you use it in the concept of that, if we did have two that were coming in at the same time, we would look to the one that we're going to give less incentives as being the one that we would pursue. Does it happen very often? No, pretty rare. Because it all depends on what you might be working on within the city in a particular project. But I think priority consideration is trying to at least give the nod to the fact that this is our desired goal. And preference is maybe not a strong enough word, but it is what we're really intending is that, we want to see projects that are in the 20%. Are we going to turn away anyone that says, oh, I really need 30% in order to do this project? No, we'll have the discussions. But ultimately, that's also something that, as we've looked at projects and presented, and I don't know the whole history because of my only 5.5 months here, but when we look at a project and we're going to bring it to you, there's also governing body comments that have been made regarding how far do we want to go with regards to our incentives to these developments. And I think what we've looked at from the discussions that have occurred with previous projects, that 20% is a number that should be put on paper as a starting point for the discussion.
Thank you, because even for us as policymakers, really, we're needing to put enough in there that the staff feels confident in the negotiation process, and the developers as well, that we certainly, but theoretically future councils as well would feel comfortable with that framework.
Well, and that's the thing, and I can tell from my past experience in other jobs, why would I want, it's not fair to you to put you in a position that says they'll only accept 30, if they don't have 30%, then you have to go, yeah, we're not doing that. If you give us that guidance up front, that helps so that we get it closer to where we can get approval. And also, that if we're actually truly bringing something forward that's more than 20%, it truly is the final offer from the developer, so that we can say, yes, we tried to follow the policy, but in the end, that is not acceptable. This needs to be the number that's considered by the developer, because we won't bring it forward given the guidance you have in the policy.
Great, thank you.
I guess, though, to either clear the muddy water or muddy it further, but I guess what I'm hearing is it's not a hard and fast rule, so it is a preference then.
And that was the idea. But what we have to,
Right.
that's where we are, is to decide what's negotiable and what's not, but to state a preference.
Sure.
So that there's some guidance to everyone involved as to what we're looking for.
I would say the fact that you call out the but-for principle and there is a target says a lot right there. Even when it's a preference and we know that it's, city manager alluded to, it's sometimes it might be a starting point or a negotiation. That's a strong statement, even stating a number. So I think that's
Sure.
a good thing, and it shows that we do have, standard and a preference and an expectation. So even if preference feels like a strong word, having a percent in there says a lot in and of itself.
I agree, yeah. So I guess I don't know at this point if we're getting into motions and stuff like that, but I guess I would either make a motion or just a suggestion, if we're not doing motions right now, that we would strike will provide priority consideration for and just say would prefer.
So that's your thought. City manager says he thinks that the priority consideration is better language. So.
I don't know if that's what he said or not.
He thought the prefer was weaker.
It is. But whether priority consideration is the right exact word, that's what we're getting after the preference part.
Right. And my experience doing the RFQ from the other side is, when you're competing, at that point, the percentages are going to matter because you're going to lose. If you're asking for 25% and your competitor's asking for 15, they're going to win, so it doesn't have to be stated. It's kind of like saying whoever gives us the lowest price, I'm going to buy it from. It's.
But often we are, in the case of TIFs, dealing with only one prospective
Right.
developer. There is not that competition, and so the staff needs to have that strength to negotiate one-on-one for a negotiated deal. I'm just
Yeah.
counterpoint on that.
Yeah, I just don't know how the words priority consideration, though,
Okay.
say
Well, let's,
that. Again,
I think we have some input and we may get some comments later. My inclination is that we probably, staff has been taking notes on these things, that we would look at this if we're going to reorder, for instance, this section. I'm thinking that as people talk, if we figure out the right name for it, and another way to do it is just to go and order from the absolutes down to the preferences, but leave them all there so it's one list and you can get on with things. But we'll see how staff wants to put it together.
Sure, absolutely.
Councilman Cohen, did you have any specifics that you wanted to ask about or suggest?
No, I don't think.
All right, thank you. I had just two, one that I know I've asked before and one that's new. This had to do with phrasing as well. The second preference currently says for third-party requests to create TIF development districts, the city will not consider unless blah, 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 blah. It seemed to me like some of the reaction we were getting was, don't say no, don't be negative about what you won't do, especially in the second item you have, now that it turned out that way. And I wondered if looking at this one, and maybe with an eye on the rest of them, to say instead something like, for third-party requests to create TIF redevelopment districts, the city will require the applicant to certify that it intends to submit a redevelopment plan. Something that's affirmative, that just focuses on rather than we won't take your application unless you got one, to simply flip the language to say we'll certify that they intend to. That gives some guidance to what the document would say, but it is affirmative and makes the point.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So that was just a thought. And I wasn't sure, it seemed also as we stripped that what we were trying to get to, that unintentionally some of the redundancies that were in there sort of seemed offensive and pushing people off. And this one continues to say, thereafter, the city will require satisfactory assurance that the project will be completed in a timely manner in accordance with the development plan. Well, what does that really say? And is it needed? Of course, we're going to want to make sure they follow it, but does that particular line just sort of reiterate the beginning and get us anywhere?
I'm sorry, where were you on that?
I'm on number 2, on page 2. It says, we've got to,
Oh, okay.
we want to get them to certify, we want to negotiate up front how soon they expect the redevelopment agreement to come through, with a preference that it be between 60 and 90 days, that we're moving quickly. And then it says after that, we would require satisfactory assurance that the project will be completed in a timely manner. We're going to have a development agreement that has a timetable in it. I don't know what else we can do.
I don't have an issue from a legal perspective of removing that sentence, because you're right, the development agreement will.
It's going to lay it out, and other than
Yeah.
that, I don't,
So
just,
strike that last
it was
sentence.
a, it was a thought that we didn't need
Sure.
it, that it
Yeah.
just made it sound like we didn't think you were going to do it, and it wouldn't have any teeth.
Doesn't, from a legal perspective,
Okay.
doesn't matter to me.
And the other one, Nikki, I think I asked you about this before, but in number 5 talks about priority on TIF redevelopment districts in areas of greatest need, such as an approved neighborhood revitalization area, redevelopment planning area, and/or similar. And then it goes on to say, and/or similar areas where significant public-private investment has been directed, consistent with infill policies. When I get that, I get the first 2, but when I get to that last phrase, it's like, oh, I don't want to just direct our TIFs into places where we're spending other money, or to have a developer feel like they need to get us involved in some stuff immediately around that with public money in order to have their project have more preference. What we're trying to do is incentivize private investment. So that kind of caught me. I don't know what you all think about, and I might have asked you about that once before.
I mean, I think yet again, this is a preference and a priority, so at the end of the day, if you're approached by a project that you all like that doesn't meet these, it's still open to that. But I think reinforces to the citizens that you're trying to live up to the statute of TIFs being for blighted areas, and that you're further reinforcing that it would typically be somewhere that you're already providing some other kind of public investment. It's a reinforcement that that's part of the goal of this whole, of even having a TIF.
I guess to
And
me-
I know the developers specifically commented that they liked this and really thought this was an important inclusion on the policy. I just think that's the importance of leaving that in. If you don't, if there's a couple of words that are bothering you.
No, it was
talk
only
about
that third phrase. I had no problem with it saying that we wanted to prioritize the areas of greatest need, such as approved neighborhood revitalization area and a redevelopment planning area. It was only drawing in that there needed to be other public investment. Because to me, if you can get a TIF and it goes in there and that is what happened, that's the keystone that helps with revitalization. I don't want anybody to feel like they need to get us to do other public projects at the same time. If their revitalization will be that recharge that we need. So it was only that third phrase that troubled me.
Madam Chair, if I may, on that, it has the and/or right now for that. You just want to take out the and just say, or other similar areas to make it more.
I guess the reason to me, the issue is that we want to place a priority in investing in areas that need it. But it shouldn't matter whether or not we've done anything else there. Our role is not the significant one in deciding whether a developer would want to come in. So I don't want to drag us into the deal.
Right. I guess my reading is, though, that entire thing is an or. In other words, like, the where significant, that's not matched up to each of these. The whole thing is an or.
Yeah, but
Right.
It troubled me to not want to put this city doing further investment in the area to all of a sudden become a criteria for somebody to to get it, or to, whereas somebody was going to go in and do a development, looking at that and going, oh, maybe I need to ask the city to do the street too, in that way. Then we get called, we're doing a lot of back and forth right now about where to put our dollars for other public investments, so I didn't want to get us dragged into a really great idea and even be part of it, not developing. City Manager.
Councilman Hiller, I think for me, when I look at this particular phrase, what we're looking at is that if we're working with a developer and say they are looking at 2 different sites, this is, for us, one of those things where we can ask the developer, if we've made some improvements in a certain area already, and it would be nice to have someone of new business, new industry move into that area we've already been doing work, so that we can look at targeting. That would then maybe be something that we could talk, if you're willing to go to this site versus that site, we'll work with you more. And it looks at trying to utilize where we've made investments in the community already. That's really what it's targeting, is if we've made an investment in an area already, it would be nice to see, say you make the public investment to improve a road, yet you have vacant lots all around it, that, we're trying to incentivize to get into that area.
I guess I think of an example, and there might not even be specific addresses on it, but when Topeka has been involved in, and companies come and talk to them about developments, and I realize that TIFs are generally have a pretty big footprint, but, with language like that, for instance, find ourselves directing somebody to an industrial park for an industrial development instead of South Kansas Avenue or South Topeka Boulevard, where we need redevelopment just as much. The old bottling plant on South Kansas Avenue or whatever it would be. And in fact, when I've asked from time to time in the past, those sites have been overlooked. Nothing's been happening there. And yet if somebody was wanting to do whatever X thousand square foot footprint of a retail or a manufacturing, I'd want them to be looking in places where nothing was going on, but it was declining, just as much as I would want them to be looking in a place where we were already involved. Or like Tom was talking about when he was developing on Wanamaker, which was neither redevelopment nor, I realized that he needed, in his example, Huntoon developed, but we hadn't done anything, or the city in the past hadn't done anything there. And it just seemed like it unnecessarily skewed where somebody would be looking, although, redevelopment planning and neighborhood revitalization, and just wouldn't want us to have been first to get the priority, or to have them feel like we had to be active.
I don't think that language requires that in any way. I think it's simply trying to show, I look at, it's done with countywide money, but you look at 49 streets going in right now. We would like to see, we're spending the money on developing 49th Street. Someday we'd like to see someone move into that area. That's why we're doing that improvement. And so if we're seeing things happen to redevelop an area or to develop an area, you'd want to move it there, although I don't think that would qualify for TIF, because I'm not sure that it's considered redevelopment. I'm not as familiar with that, but that type of situation, if we're spending money and improving infrastructure, we then hope that the improvement comes along with it.
Okay, thanks. There are of course procedural kinds of things. I remember I not long ago talked to somebody about whether we shouldn't be targeting like our corporate, trying to attract corporate headquarters or new companies here to the old hotel that's at 10th and Monroe. And because it's not been seen as an industrial site or a development site, it wasn't on radar at all to the folks that I talked to, yet to me, I don't know whether you'd call it a development site or a redevelopment site or not, but it certainly needs it. And with the jail right behind it, just not anybody will go in there, but it's a building that could handle redevelopment. So again, I guess it's not just policy, it's just how people think about it and see. I just want our policy to not guide people away from those existing buildings.
Sure.
So, but your points are well taken. So, any other? Well, I didn't hear, Mrs. Lee, any comments or concerns about the categories as you had them and as they are in this second draft? Any concerns, just some technicalities about the preferences and possibly submission of some wordsmithing suggestions? Beyond what we've talked about today, I'm looking at Mr. DeFreeze and Ms. Stork.
I think some of the things that we just talked about
Are the things that you would have had? All right, well, if we have talked about all the issues, then maybe all we need is look at my colleagues as well, to ask staff to prepare a final draft based on the comments today. That will not involve a lot of changes to what we see. Get them out to us and schedule a meeting fairly soon. If we can hit it, our report back date to the council is the 16th of May. If we can, just the default report back, but if we could get this finalized by the end of April, I think we can hit that deadline, can we not, City Manager? Just be able to produce a policy? How's that sound?
So we need to meet again to,
One more week or 2 weeks to meet again, or are we going to take it right to the council?
No, we need to meet again and vote out a document to the council. Calendaring-wise, and sometimes the committee work gets a little more slack, but in terms of being ready totally before the agenda, 2 weeks out, but I'm thinking here, the agenda meeting before May 16th would be May the 2nd. So if we were able to meet, today's the 19th. If we were able to meet next week or the 30th at the latest, or the 1st actually, but we've got a council meeting that day, then we'd be able to finish this and have it submitted in full schedule time. Do you think we could do that?
Yeah.
Committee members, do you think
Sorry.
we would be able to meet? I think it would be brief next
what
week.
day are you proposing? Just any time next week?
I didn't have a day yet, but we could, I like settling it before we walk out the door, if we can,
Sure.
if it's easy. Do you have good or bad times?
No times are good, Karen.
Understood. When can you have the draft ready, do you think?
Tomorrow. I mean, we'll have it, as soon as you're ready to meet, we can have the draft ready.
All right, so the draft could be ready as soon as tomorrow, which means that even by Tuesday next week, if people think we're inside it enough that you don't need a lot of time to look at it, we'll send it out to you all as well.
If text quit popping up here, I could tell you.
I would say Tuesday or later next week, see what you have.
I'm out Tuesday.
You're out Tuesday, okay, Wednesday or later next week.
Is there a certain amount of notice we need to give for meetings?
48 hours for open meetings.
Yeah. No, just reasonable notice.
Okay,
How about this Friday afternoon work for anybody?
this Friday?
Yeah.
27th.
Oh, the
2 days.
27th?
Well, I meant the 20th, but
Tomorrow?
is today Thursday? Today is Thursday, sorry. Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that wouldn't work. Okay.
27th's good.
We're talking about the 25th, 26th, or 27th, it sounds like.
Yeah, 27th be good for me.
In the morning? For me, it needs to be morning or early afternoon.
Morning's fine with me.
9? 9:30, 9
I'm
o'clock?
not sure if it works for you, but it works for
Is it better for you
Us
to have
probably.
first thing in the morning and then just get on with your day?
Not really.
Doesn't matter?
Yeah, it
Okay.
doesn't matter. Though, I'm sorry.
Do you all have a conference?
I have a conference over in Lawrence that I'm at on Friday morning, 27th.
We could,
Afternoon's fine, too.
probably excuse unless, I mean, this has been really helpful to have you here. Would you rather be here for that final discussion for us? Okay, so that means not Friday morning, is it just Friday morning?
I would be back by about 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock?
Or, well, so that we're not pinching him, would like 3 o'clock work better?
The ribbon cutting at the Abbott Center is at 3. I don't know if anybody was going. I don't have to go. I just have it on my calendar. 3 o'clock? We can do that.
Sure, okay. Friday the 27th at 3 o'clock.
All right.
Got it.
We'll get a planner out on it, but at least we got it.
I guess we'll know where, if it's here or Holiday.
The staff will have to
Yes,
find the location.
yes. Okay. That should be a relatively short meeting.
Yes, it should. With that, we have, are there any other items that people wanted to address today? Seeing none, meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.